Sacred Heart's emergency room in Savannah pulses under fluorescent lights, antiseptic sharp in the air like a blade. Steel gurneys line the walls. Danielle Ross moves through the controlled chaos with the kind of precision that comes from holding someone's artery closed while incoming fire cracked the walls around you. No one watching would recognize that precision. They saw only a soft-spoken nurse in her mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, moving between beds with practiced efficiency. She paused at the supply cabinet on the east wall, her eyes tracking the inventory log. Her hands moved across the boxes with muscle memory, the same hands that had once sutured a carotid vein in a field tent outside Sangin using nothing but trembling light from a helmet-mounted flashlight and the will to keep a man breathing. She frowned at the log entry. Duplicate arterial clamps. Third time this month. The medical supply company had billed Sacred Heart for 18 units when the hospital had received and stocked only 12. She made a note on her clipboard, precise and small, her handwriting like military block lettering. The locker room smelled like stale coffee and the ghost of someone's perfume. Danielle opened her assigned locker and reached for her stethoscope. There, on the bottom shelf beneath her personal items, sat a pair of worn combat boots. The leather was cracked and faded, the laces still tied tight from the last time they'd been removed, 8 years ago, on a day she'd made herself forget. She closed the locker door quickly. The boots stayed hidden. They always did. Dr. James Hargrove stood at the nurse's station, his silver hair perfectly styled, his watch, the Rolex Submariner worth more than most nurses earned in 4 months, catching the overhead light. He was 54, handsome in that particular way that came from knowing you could afford to be, and his eyes tracked Danielle as she returned to her work. He watched as she photographed an invoice with her phone, her jaw tight with concentration. The image went into a folder on her phone labeled Billing Review. She had done this 17 times in the past 6 weeks. Hargrove leaned toward the charge nurse, a woman named Patricia who had worked at Sacred Heart for 19 years and understood which way the wind blew. His voice was low, conversational, the kind of tone that made threats sound like gossip. "She's making problems," he said. Patricia didn't look up from her computer. "Danielle. She's questioning supply orders. Taking pictures. Yesterday I saw her comparing our invoices to the hospital in Macon, found cheaper pricing on standard equipment. She's looking at our numbers like they're a puzzle." Patricia finally glanced at him. There was something careful in her expression, the look of someone who had learned to navigate men like Hargrove. "She's thorough." "She's nosy," Hargrove corrected. His fingers drummed the countertop, a rhythm like impatience. "And thorough people ask questions. Questions lead places I don't want them to go." What Danielle didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know from her position at the trauma bay, checking the defibrillator's paddle charge and confirming the crash cart medications were current, was that Dr. Hargrove had spent the last 3 years cultivating a very specific relationship with a medical supply company called Pinnacle Healthcare Solutions. That relationship had generated $240,000 in kickbacks, deposited quarterly into an offshore account in Grand Cayman. The invoices were expertly padded. The overcharges looked like simple administrative errors. No one had questioned them until a quiet nurse with the wrong kind of training started looking at spreadsheets. Danielle felt his stare. She had learned to feel stares in places where a stare could mean someone was calculating how to kill you. She took one measured breath, the kind of breath that came from a place deep in her training, and she continued her charting without acknowledgement. Her voice, when she spoke into the radio, was even and professional. "Trauma Bay 1, we're ready for admit," she said. The response crackled back immediately. "ETA for minutes." She noted the time on the monitor, 14:23. For minutes meant they had time to set up. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact preparation in environments far more hostile than Savannah's busiest emergency room. The 4 stands were positioned. The monitor cables were laid out. The suction catheter was tested. Her hands didn't hesitate. Her hands never hesitated. Hargrove watched the way she moved. There was something about her movements that bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. She moved like someone who had spent years in high-consequence environments, like her body had been trained to respond to crisis as a first language rather than a learned skill. Nurses didn't usually move like that. Nurses were trained to be efficient, yes, but this was different. This was muscle memory. This was the kind of precision you earned through repetition in situations where the cost of failure was someone's death. He turned away, his expression hardening. He had made his decision even before the patient arrived. In the break room later that afternoon, Hargrove stood before the assembled nursing staff, 7 people clustered around the coffee machine and the small table where they took their 15-minute breaks. Danielle was not among them. She was in the unit, finishing her charting. Hargrove had timed this carefully. "I'm making a bet," he announced, his voice carrying the kind of casual confidence that came from knowing people would listen. "Our newest full-time nurse, Danielle, solid worker, no complaints on her record, but I'm betting she's gone within 7 days. Gone. Not quitting dramatically. Just gone." Patricia looked up from her coffee. There was something knowing in her expression, something that suggested she understood exactly what he was doing and why he was saying it where everyone could hear. "She's a good nurse, James." "Sure she is," Hargrove agreed, his smile never wavering. "But I'm sensing she's not the right fit for Sacred Heart's culture. Some people don't last in emergency medicine. It gets to them. The pressure. The long shifts. The emotional toll. She's the type." No one challenged him. No one ever challenged Dr. Hargrove. He was the ER director. He was the one with the authority, the one who made the staffing decisions, the one whose approval or disapproval could make or break a nursing career in a hospital system as interconnected as Savannah's. When Danielle finished her charting at 17:45, she noticed the energy in the unit had shifted. The subtle change that happened after someone had been discussed in a room they weren't present in. She recognized it. She had felt it before, in different contexts, in places where being talked about in your absence was often the prelude to something worse. She locked her personal items in her locker, her fingers briefly touching the edge of her boot, the only thing in that space that was hers in any real sense. Then she closed the door and left for the day. The rain had begun to fall sometime during her shift, the kind of Georgia rain that came down sideways, heavy and insistent. She walked to her car without hurrying. She had walked through worse things than rain. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent hum. Dr. Hargrove gathered the staff during shift change, his tailored jacket catching the harsh overhead light as he leaned against the counter. Danielle stood at the coffee maker, pouring black into a ceramic cup that had permanent stains along its rim, when his voice cut through the room like a blade. "I'm making a friendly wager," Hargrove announced, his tone dripping with false camaraderie. "Our newest nurse, Miss Danielle, won't last the week. Any takers?" Laughter rippled through the gathered staff. 3 nurses, 2 residents, a phlebotomist. The sound was the kind of laughter that didn't require humor, just permission. Danielle's hand remained steady as she poured. The coffee steamed. Her shoulders didn't tense. Her jaw didn't clench. But a single tear escaped down her cheek, sliding like a track mark of salt water, and she wiped it away without turning around. When she spoke, her voice was calm as deep water, measured as a held breath. "I've lasted through worse than workplace gossip, Doctor." The room went silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Someone shifted their weight. Hargrove's expression hardened for a fraction of a second before he recovered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and then he turned away, dismissing her with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to never being questioned. But he had seen something in her voice, a depth, a composure, that made the bet feel suddenly less like mockery and more like a miscalculation. He didn't like miscalculations. 2 days later, Danielle carried her lunch tray through the crowded cafeteria at 12:36 p.m. Salisbury steak, slightly congealed under the heat lamp. Green beans with butter sauce. Apple juice in a plastic cup. The cafeteria was packed with hospital staff rotating through shifts, voices creating a white noise of overlapping conversations. She moved through the crowd with the same precision she moved through everything else, economical, purposeful, aware of every body and every exit. Hargrove was waiting near the condiment station. He didn't make it obvious. He never did. When she passed, his elbow rose. Just slightly. Just enough. The tray hit the tile floor with a sound like breaking bone. Food scattered across the white ceramic, meat sliding one direction, beans pooling in congealing grease, the plastic cup spinning on its edge before settling into a puddle of apple juice that spread like a stain across her white rubber shoes. Staff at nearby tables froze mid-conversation. Forks paused. One resident half stood from her chair. Danielle was kneeling before the commotion fully registered, her movements controlled, mechanical, picking up the tray pieces with her bare hands. Clumsy hands, sweetheart, Hargrove said, his voice pitched so the surrounding tables could hear. Maybe nursing isn't your calling. Danielle stood slowly, tray pieces in her hands, apple juice dripping from her fingertips. She made eye contact, a direct, unwavering, the kind of eye contact that made most people look away first. Hers never broke. My hands have held things you couldn't imagine, doctor. They don't shake. She walked to the trash and disposed of the tray, her scrubs now stained, her shoes wet. She walked to the bathroom and cleaned her hands under warm water, watching the apple juice spiral down the drain. She didn't eat lunch that day. She returned to work. The third incident came during late afternoon rounds. 3 residents trailed behind Dr. Hargrove as he moved through the patient census with the authority of someone who believed authority was something that could be performed rather than earned. Danielle carried the chart for room for 12, reviewing labs before the team arrived. Hargrove reached out, took the chart from her hands, and threw it. Not forcefully. With control. The metal clipboard clattered against the tile floor at her feet, pages scattering like feathers. Pick that up, sweetheart, he drawled, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture casual as someone discussing the weather. Unless you're too good for basic tasks. The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a first year from Boston Medical, looked like she wanted to speak. The other 2 said nothing. Silence pooled around them like something with weight. Danielle took one measured breath. Let a single tear escape which she wiped away without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice was steady as a held rifle, each word articulated with the precision of someone who had given orders in places where hesitation meant death. I've picked up pieces of men in the desert, doctor. A clipboard doesn't scare me. She bent, retrieved the chart, gathered the scattered pages. As she straightened, something shifted in the hallway's air pressure. The residents were staring at her. Not at her uniform. Not at her position. At her. At something they couldn't name but recognized the shape of. Hargrove's smile had frozen on his face like something that had to be maintained by will alone. Danielle walked past him and continued with rounds as if nothing had occurred. But that wasn't entirely true. Something had occurred. A boundary had been drawn. Not with anger. With something worse than anger. With certainty. Hargrove waited in his office for 45 minutes after that. He sat at his desk, clicking his pen against the mahogany surface, click, 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 a rhythm that felt like thinking out loud. The bet in the break room was supposed to have rattled her. The cafeteria incident was supposed to have pushed her into resignation or tears or some combination of both. The chart was supposed to be the final humiliation, the moment when she chose to walk away rather than endure another shift. Instead, she had stared him down with the composure of someone who had already survived worse than he could inflict. His power, he realized with something approaching fury, was circumstantial. It worked on people who cared about their reputation in a hospital. It worked on people who believed they had something to lose. This woman, quiet, competent, wearing worn shoes and scrubs that had a permanent coffee stain near the pocket, appeared to have already calculated what could be taken from her and decided the loss was acceptable. He would need a different strategy. The ambulance bay doors exploded open at 4:23 p.m. with a blast of humid Savannah air, the kind of heat that makes the asphalt smell like burned rubber and diesel exhaust. Paramedics rushed in a stretcher carrying a man in civilian clothes, mid-50s, weathered hands, and a face that suggested years of compound decisions and compartmentalized information. Blood soaked through makeshift pressure dressings on his chest and left shoulder, bright red seeping into the white gauze in perfect circles. GSW at a home invasion, multiple fragment wounds, BP dropping, tachycardic at 142, the lead paramedic shouted into the organized chaos of the trauma team mobilizing. Estimated blood loss 2 liters pre-hospital, no field intubation, 2 large bore falls established. Danielle took position immediately at the trauma bay, her hands already moving, already assessing. She peeled back the dressing on the chest, wound and froze for a microsecond, maybe half of one. The wound pattern was wrong for civilian ammunition. The fragments weren't random. They were uniform. Organized. Military grade. The kind of fragmentation that came from ordnance designed by engineers instead of accident. Shrapnel. She had seen these wounds before. She had created pressure protocols for these wounds before. In another life. In another uniform. A man in a dark suit appeared in the doorway, flashing credentials to the security officer, speaking urgently into a phone with the tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. He identified himself to the attending physician as a military liaison. His name was Torres. His eyes were the color of storm clouds over open water, and they moved across the trauma bay like they were conducting an audit. Dr. Hargrove swept into the bay, pushing past the military liaison. "I'll handle this case personally," he announced, shouldering Danielle aside with deliberate force. "Stand back, Nurse Ross." She moved to the wall. Watched. Hargrove began ordering standard protocols, the protocols taught in the textbooks, the ones designed for civilian trauma, the ones that assumed unlimited blood supply and time. His hands were competent. They were just wrong for what they were treating. The patient, Colonel Marcus Reeve, Delta Force, though his chart would read construction contractor to anyone who didn't know how to read between the classified lines, grimaced in pain as Hargrove's technique caused additional bleeding. The wound was already beginning to show signs of tension, the kind of slow-building pressure that came from internal bleeding with nowhere to go except into the space where lungs needed room to expand. Torres stepped closer to Danielle, his body angled toward the wall, his voice low enough that only she could hear. He had been watching her hands before Hargrove arrived. He had been watching them now. "That stitch pattern you started," he whispered. "That's a Sangin technique. Where the hell did you learn that?" Danielle kept her eyes on the monitors. On the numbers. On the graph lines that told stories in vital sign language. Her voice, when it came, was small and carefully constructed. Trauma rotation. Textbook. Torres opened his mouth. Closed it. His eyes narrowed with the kind of suspicion that came from recognizing something that wasn't supposed to exist in civilian hospital corridors. A senior chief petty officer, supposedly erased, was standing 3 feet away from him picking up pieces of a man he had worked with for 7 years. But he didn't speak. Instead, he turned back to watch the monitors, his jaw working like he was processing information that didn't have a classification level high enough to contain it. The heart monitor beeped its mechanical rhythm. The ventilator hadn't been placed yet, but it would be. The blood pressure was dropping in real time, 112/68, then 108/64, then 104/61. A gentle slide toward something worse. Danielle stood against the wall and watched the man she had trained with, the man she had carried out of Helmand Province 6 years ago, begin the slow process of going into shock under the care of someone who didn't know what he was actually treating. What happened next ended careers. The ambulance bay doors at Sacred Heart exploded inward at 14:53, paramedics moving in controlled chaos with a stretcher that carried a man whose presence seemed to compress the air around him. Colonel Marcus Reeve, Delta Force, shrapnel embedded in his left shoulder and upper chest, his breath shallow and deliberate like someone who had trained his own physiology into submission. The paramedic called out vitals in the practiced monotone of someone who had done this 1,000 times in places that didn't appear on maps. 42-year-old male, blast wound to anterior chest and left shoulder, 3 fragments still in situ, BP 118/76 and holding, O2 sat 97% on high flow, alert and oriented, ETA to surgery 6 minutes from now. Dr. Hargrove was already moving, his white coat billowing behind him like a cape, already assuming command with the casual authority of a man who had never been questioned. Danielle watched from her position near the supply cart, her hand steady, her eyes tracking the colonel's breathing pattern, the slight tension in his facial muscles, the way his left hand gripped the stretcher rail with the kind of control that came from compartmentalization. She had seen that look before. She had worn that look. Torres, the military liaison assigned to Sacred Heart for coordinated casualty response, appeared at the colonel's side, a former army medic with forearms scarred like road maps and eyes that had watched too many men die in spaces between what the world knew and what the Pentagon kept secret. He was already assessing, his movements sharp and practiced, his voice clipped. "Colonel, we're getting you straight to OR, best trauma team in Georgia." The colonel's eyes found Torres's for exactly 1 second, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared weight, shared geography, shared ghosts. Danielle moved without thinking, muscle memory converting intention into motion, her hands already reaching for gloves, already calculating the blood loss trajectory, already running the battlefield protocols through her mind that no civilian hospital ever taught. Hargrove was issuing orders like he was conducting an orchestra, get him to Trauma 1, type and cross for 6 units, full trauma workup, call surgery now, his voice carrying the particular arrogance of someone who had never operated outside of controlled environments, who had never sutured a wound while rounds were landing 200 meters away, who had never held a man's intestines together with one hand while applying pressure with the other because there was no one else and time was a substance being consumed in real time. Danielle moved into position at the patient's left side as they transferred him from ambulance stretcher to hospital stretcher, her hands finding their place in the choreography of emergency medicine. The colonel's shoulder wound was immediately visible, ragged, dark, the kind of injury that looked survivable until you understood the trajectory, the tissue damage, the arterial exposure. Hargrove was calling for the ultrasound, calling for labs, calling for imaging, his movements becoming increasingly theatrical, the kind of performance that occurred when someone needed the room to know they were in charge. The shrapnel glinted under the fluorescent lights like something fractured from a different world. Danielle's hands moved into position, and without waiting for instruction, without asking permission, she began what the Pentagon had classified as a field-expedient vascular control technique, a method of reducing hemorrhage in the preoperative environment using pressure, precision, and the kind of anatomical knowledge that came from practicing on things that were already dead so you could save things that were still living. Her fingers found the pressure points, the arterial pathways, the small arteries bleeding in fractional increments that would accumulate, would compound, would kill him if left unaddressed. Her movements were economical, each gesture carrying the weight of doctrine learned in a place called Sangin, in a province called Helmand, in an operation that officially never happened. Torres froze. His hand stopped mid-motion, the crash cart supplies he was organizing suddenly forgotten, his eyes locked onto Danielle's hands, onto the specific compression pattern, onto the angle of her fingers, onto the fact that she was performing a procedure that existed in classified training manuals and nowhere else. His voice came out as a whisper, rough as gravel. "That's a Sangin stitch. Where the hell did you learn that?" Danielle didn't answer. She didn't look up. She didn't break her focus, didn't acknowledge that he had just identified her, categorized her, placed her into a framework that contradicted everything she appeared to be. Hargrove didn't hear the question. Hargrove was already moving to the head of the bed, already adjusting ventilator settings, already performing the role of trauma surgeon with the kind of confidence that came from never having his authority challenged. The colonel's oxygen saturation glowed on the monitor, 97, 98, 99%, steady, holding, perfect. 20 minutes into the procedure, the numbers began their descent. 93%. 89%. The kind of drop that wasn't supposed to happen after Danielle had controlled the hemorrhage, after Hargrove had transfused 2 units of O negative, after all the protocols had been executed in the correct sequence. 84%. The monitor's alarm tone shifted, higher, more urgent, a sound like a digital scream. The colonel's chest was moving now, but asymmetrically, the left side barely lifting, the right side compensating, overexpanding, the mechanism of a body trying to survive something that was killing it from the inside. Danielle saw it before anyone else articulated it. The shape of the chest. The absence of breath sounds on the left. The way the trachea was beginning its slow deviation toward the right, the cardinal sign of a tension pneumothorax, a collapsed lung under pressure, air bleeding into the thoracic cavity, compressing the heart, suffocating the colonel from inside his own body. 78%. 72%. Danielle stepped forward from her position at the supply cart, her voice pitched at the frequency of medical authority, not request. Doctor, he's developing a tension pneumothorax. We need immediate needle decompression. Hargrove's head snapped toward her with the velocity of something predatory. His face flushed, the red rising from his collar like a thermometer responding to heat. His hypoxic from residual blood loss. We need transfusion, not your amateur diagnosis. He moved, physically positioning himself between Danielle and the patient, his body a barrier, his authority a wall. His voice carried the kind of venom that revealed the real wound, the real injury, the fact that he had already been disrespected by her presence, by her competence, by the implication that someone at the supply cart level could see what he, the attending physician, was failing to perceive. Step back, nurse, before I have you removed from my ER. The words were a threat. They were also a command. They were also the last mistake he would make in this particular configuration of power. Colonel Reeves' lips were turning blue. The specific blue of oxygen deprivation, the color of a man whose blood was becoming less capable of carrying the gas his lungs could no longer deliver. The monitor alarm was a continuous shriek now, the kind of sound that made every nurse's autonomic nervous system trigger toward panic. 65% oxygen saturation. 64. Torres had both hands on the bed rail, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles were visible in his neck, his combat medic training screaming at him, his knowledge of anatomy and physics and the mathematics of death absolutely certain about what was happening, but he had no authority here, no standing to override the physician, no voice in this particular ecosystem. Danielle made her choice in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She didn't ask again. She didn't defer. She moved around Hargrove with a kind of precision that suggested his physical position was irrelevant, that his blocking stance was a variable she had already accounted for and dismissed. Her hand found the crash cart, found the 14-gauge angiocath needle with the same certainty that a pianist's fingers find middle C. The sensation of the needle sliding into her palm was tactile, familiar, the weight of it a confirmation of something that had been waiting to be remembered. She counted the ribs, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical landmark that was burned into muscle memory from a training program that didn't officially exist. Her other hand found the colonel's chest, palpated the landmarks, and the needle went in with a kind of smooth insertion that indicated perfect angle, perfect depth, perfect understanding of the three-dimensional architecture of the human body. The hiss came immediately, a sound like air escaping from a punctured tire, a sound like pressure release, a sound like survival becoming possible again. Colonel Reeve gasped, not from pain but from the sudden expansion of his lungs, from the pressure equalizing, from the geometry of his chest cavity returning to the configuration necessary for life. The monitor numbers began their climb. 68%. 74%. 82%. 89%. The blue fading from his lips in real time, replaced by the pink of adequate oxygenation, the physiological evidence that the procedure had worked, that the diagnosis had been correct, that the intervention had been precisely timed and perfectly executed. Hargrove's face cycled through colors, white to red to something approaching purple, the specific rage of someone whose authority had just been publicly superseded by someone he had defined as subordinate. His hand was already moving toward his phone, already reaching for the institutional power that was his only remaining leverage. You just assaulted my patient. You performed a procedure outside your scope. You're done here. Security is being called right now. His voice shook with something that wasn't just anger, it was the trembling of a man whose control had just evaporated, whose command structure had just collapsed, whose understanding of the hierarchy had been fundamentally rewired by someone holding a 14-gauge needle and the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. Danielle set the needle down on the sterile field and turned her attention back to the colonel, whose breathing was now adequate, whose oxygen saturation was climbing toward normalcy, whose life had just been saved by someone whose official job description never included this particular skill. Torres was already moving, his military phone already in his hand, his fingers already texting something to someone, his expression carrying the specific intensity of a man who had just recognized a legend standing in front of him and was already setting events in motion that would change the architecture of this entire room. The colonel opened his eyes. His pupils tracked. His hand reached out and gripped Danielle's wrist with the strength of a man who understood exactly what had just happened, who understood the cost of her action, who understood that she had just violated the professional boundaries that were supposed to protect her from this exact moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough as concrete. 2 words. Everything else was silence. The colonel's chest rose once. Fell silent. His left side no longer symmetrical. No breath sounds. Tension pneumothorax. Death arriving in seconds. Dr. Hargrove stood frozen at the monitor. His hands hung at his sides like artifacts from someone else's body. The attending surgeon beside him whispered, "We need to decompress." Hargrove didn't move. His jaw clenched. His eyes fixed on the falling oxygen saturation, 88, 82, 76, as if staring could reverse it. The room smelled of copper blood and fear sweat. Nurses waited for an order that didn't come. Danielle moved before thought completed. Her hand found the emergency crash cart in one fluid motion, the kind of motion that lives in muscle memory, the kind that comes from having done this before when the before officially didn't exist. 14-gauge angiocath needle. She didn't ask permission. She didn't pause for protocol. She stepped to the colonel's side, located the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line by feel alone, and drove the needle home between his ribs. The hiss of air escaping was the sound of a man returning to life. The colonel gasped. His chest rose symmetrical again. The monitor climbed, 79, 84, 91, 98. His eyes fluttered. A low groan escaped his throat that sounded like prayer. Dr. Hargrove's face transformed. Not with relief. With something colder. The kind of look a man gets when he realizes he's been publicly exposed as paralyzed while a nurse saved a 4-star colonel's life in front of 17 witnesses. His eyes locked on Danielle with the flat intensity of measured hatred. "Get her away from the patient," Hargrove said quietly. But the colonel was moving now, breathing now, alive now. The military liaison, Torres, stepped forward with a nod to Danielle that carried the weight of recognition. He knew. He'd always known. She didn't acknowledge him. She was already backing away from the bed, her hands falling to her sides, her posture shifting from command back into the shape of someone who was supposed to be invisible. It took Hargrove exactly 45 minutes to make the first call. He sat in his office, the corner office with the mahogany desk and the medical school diploma from Hopkins, and he dialed Gregory Chen, the board chairman. Chen owed him a favor. Hargrove had testified in a malpractice case 3 years ago, testimony that had kept Chen from losing his medical license. Hargrove never collected on favors. Until now. "Greg, we have a situation," Hargrove said into the phone, his voice smooth as sedative. "One of my nurses performed an invasive procedure today without authorization. Needle decompression. Technically within nursing scope in emergencies, but she acted with such recklessness, such assumption of authority, that I'm concerned about her credentials and her stability. I need this documented and investigated immediately. Full background check. References contacted. The works." Chen listened. Chen agreed. Chen promised the investigation would be thorough and discreet. The second call came 12 minutes later. Hargrove dialed the number for Mercy General School of Nursing where Danielle had graduated 16 years ago. He reached the dean's voicemail at 4:41 p.m. "This is Dr. Marcus Hargrove from Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah. I'm calling regarding one of your graduates, Danielle Ross, class of 2008. We're conducting a routine credentialing review and have some concerns regarding possible boundary violations and credential irregularities that may require verification. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. This is time-sensitive. He left his number. He hung up. He didn't mention that the operation she'd performed had saved a military officer's life. He didn't mention that she'd acted with the precision of someone trained for exactly this moment. He didn't mention any of that. The third call went to Steinberg Medical Practices Investigator, a firm that existed in the grey space between hospital legal liability and character assassination. Hargrove had used them before. They were efficient. I need a rapid investigation into scope violations by a registered nurse, he said. Danielle Ross at Sacred Heart Hospital, Savannah. She performed what I'm characterizing as unauthorized invasive procedures, specifically needle decompression for tension pneumothorax, without direct physician supervision. I'm concerned about her judgment and her stability. I need documentation that supports termination for cause. And I need it within 24 hours. Steinberg promised 24 hours. By the time Danielle finished charting in the ICU at 6:15 p.m., the machinery was already grinding. She didn't know it yet. She stood in the staff locker room still wearing her blood-stained scrubs, still running on the chemical afterglow of crisis management, when the door opened. Hargrove entered with 2 security guards flanking him like brackets around a threat. Behind them came Patricia Walls from HR, holding a manila folder and a cardboard box. Hargrove didn't close the door. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the hallway to fill with staff members straining to see what happened next. Danielle Ross, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the formality of a sentence being read, "You are terminated, effective immediately, for gross violation of scope of practice, insubordination, and reckless endangerment of a patient. You will surrender your badge, return all hospital property, and be escorted from the premises." Patricia held out the termination letter. The words on it had been written before the colonel ever crashed, before the decompression, before any of it. Hargrove had prepared this document at 3 o'clock that afternoon, knowing only that he needed her gone. He'd simply been waiting for the perfect moment to use it. Danielle stood slowly. Her jaw tightened. Her hands moved with deliberate precision, the precision of someone performing a procedure she'd learned long ago. She reached for the lanyard around her neck, the employee badge that marked her as part of this hospital's machinery, and she placed it on the wooden bench. The lanyard made no sound. It was the silence that filled the room instead. The silence of 17 people watching a woman be unmade. She opened her locker and began to load the box. The framed photograph of her son Michael at his high school graduation. Her second stethoscope, the one she kept in her locker for backup. A paperback novel she'd been reading for 3 months without turning more than 20 pages. A pair of white shoes, barely worn. The careful inventory of a life lived in intervals. At the bottom of the locker sat the boots. They were leather, weathered to the color of old bone. The laces were frayed. The soles were worn through at the heels from 10,000 miles of desert patrol. They were the only item she'd kept from the life before, the life that officially never happened, the life before the order came down that Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had to disappear and be replaced by a quiet nurse who questioned supply invoices and saved lives in silence. She placed the boots on top of the box. Hargrove smiled. He actually smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he'd won, who believed that removing her from his sight would eliminate the threat she posed to his arrangement with the supply company, who believed that humiliation in front of witnesses would feel like victory. The security guards flanked her as she walked through the ER. The same hallway she'd walked this morning. The same fluorescent lights. The same antiseptic smell that never quite masked the underlying scent of human suffering. But now she was walking it as a dismissed employee, carrying a cardboard box of her professional dismissal, visible to every nurse and technician and doctor who worked these corridors. Nurses whispered in doorways. One of them was Torres, the military liaison, and his expression said everything his words couldn't say in the hospital. She didn't look at him. She kept walking. She kept the box level. Her breathing remained steady. The automatic doors opened into Savannah's evening heat. The security guard escorted her to the parking lot and watched as she loaded the box into her car. His job was to ensure she left. His job was to be the physical manifestation of the decision that she no longer belonged. That night, rain came down on Savannah like judgment. Danielle stood in Hillcrest Cemetery, water streaming down her face, mixing with something that might have been tears or might have been just the rain. Her clothes were soaked. The boots, still in her car, had come here with her to this place. She knelt before a granite headstone that read, Lieutenant James Ross, USNEOD, 1985 to 2014, beloved husband and father. The mud was soft under her knees. The rain hammered the grass. A distant siren wailed toward someone else's emergency while she knelt before her own. I tried to stay invisible like they ordered. Baby, she whispered to the headstone, her voice steady even as tears cut channels down her rain-soaked face. After Sangin, after they erased everything, after they told me I had to disappear and never surface and never use what I knew, I tried. I worked in the ER and kept my head down and questioned supply invoices and stayed small and stayed quiet. But I failed. She gripped the cold granite. I couldn't just let him die. The Colonel. I couldn't just stand there and watch a man bleed out when my hand knew how to save him. And now they've taken everything again. Thunder rolled across the cemetery like artillery beginning to rain down. She knelt there in the dark and the rain, 5 hours after the Colonel had crashed, 5 hours after she performed the procedure that saved his life, 5 hours after she'd been escorted out of the hospital with her belongings in a cardboard box and her combat boots on top like a coffin on a hearse. She had no idea that the machinery she'd just triggered was infinitely larger than one hospital, one doctor, one man's vendetta against a nurse who threatened his profit margins. Dr. Hargrove excused himself from the conference room with the careful composure of a man whose entire architecture of power was collapsing in real time. He walked quickly through the corridor, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile floor like a metronome counting down to ruin, his face a mask of institutional authority that fooled no one who understood what was actually happening. His hands trembled as he gripped the elevator rail, not from fear but from the mathematical precision of a man calculating exactly how much time remained before the machinery he'd set in motion turned inward and consumed him. His office door clicked shut behind him. He sat at his desk, the mahogany surface cleared except for a titanium nameplate and a photograph of his medical school graduation, and he reached for his computer keyboard with fingers that didn't feel entirely his own. The hospital's security system required an administrative override code. He had it. He typed. The screen flashed green. Access granted. He pulled up the footage from the past 2 weeks. The break room bet, every word captured by the camera mounted above the coffee machine. The cafeteria incident, her tray sliding across the floor in slow motion, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that suggested she was cataloging information for later use. The chart-throwing moment, that smirk he'd felt so confident in, so dominant. He selected the first file. Click delete. A progress bar appeared. 50%. 75%. 100%. Access denied. File locked by system administrator. His jaw clenched. Wrong terminal. He tried again from a different workstation. Same message. Again. The same response repeated like a prayer in a language God had stopped speaking. His phone vibrated on the desk. Gregory Chen, the board chairman. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot where rain had begun to fall with the kind of insistence that suggested the sky had something to say and wasn't interested in negotiation. While Hargrove stood motionless in his office, staring at rain that offered no answers, Marcus Kim sat in the basement IT department surrounded by 3 FBI agents whose presence had transformed a fluorescent-lit server room into something that felt like the inside of a judge's gavel just before it came down. Kim was thin, 43, with the kind of posture that comes from years of sitting in hums in Helmand Province watching for IEDs in the dirt between towns that no longer existed on most maps. He pulled up his encrypted backup server and began to talk. I noticed the unusual access patterns 3 months ago, he said, his voice carrying the flat precision of someone who had learned to report facts without emotion because emotion got people killed. Dr. Hargrove was systematically reviewing security footage, not standard practice for a department head. I created a backup protocol. Everything mirrors to an encrypted server he doesn't know exists. Military habit. Always have a fallback position. The FBI agents leaned in. Kim played the footage. The break room, Hargrove's voice clear and condescending. I'll give her 1 week before she quits. She's soft. It's written all over her. The cafeteria, her tray hitting the floor, her posture never wavering. The chart-throwing moment, Hargrove's smirk as he said, "Pick that up, sweetheart," and her response, that voice, steady as a rifle sight, "I've picked up pieces of men in the desert, doctor. A clipboard doesn't scare me." Kim paused the footage. That's when he knew she was a threat. Kim continued without being asked. The financial records appeared on the screen, supply orders from Medicon Medical Supply Corp., quantities that made no medical sense, prices that defied market logic. $12,000 defibrillators when the standard is $4,000. 50 case orders of 18-gauge needles when the hospital uses 6 cases per month. The pattern repeats every billing cycle. One agent made notes. Another made a phone call that lasted exactly 30 seconds. When Senior Chief Ross started questioning the invoice discrepancies, Kim continued, she was 3 weeks away from noticing the shell company routing the kickback payments. She was methodical. She was thorough. And she was about to dismantle a 7-figure fraud scheme that had been running for almost 4 years. He pulled up the offshore account structure. These transfers total $870,000. Hargrove's share was approximately 40%. He needed her gone before she connected the dots. Back in Hargrove's office, his door opened without a knock. 2 men in dark suits, badges on their belts like credentials from a system that didn't care about his medical degree or his board connections or his carefully cultivated reputation. Dr. Richard Hargrove, we need you to come with us regarding healthcare fraud, insurance billing violations, and witness intimidation. His legs didn't buckle so much as simply refuse to obey the signals his brain was sending. The senior agent placed handcuffs on his wrists with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested he had done this approximately 800 times before. The conference room doors opened. The FBI agents escorted Hargrove past the assembled board, past Danielle who stood with her hand steady, past Colonel Reeve who watched him with the eyes of someone who had seen actual evil in actual deserts and recognized a much smaller variety of the same thing. Chairman Chen stood as Hargrove passed. Your medical privileges are immediately suspended pending investigation. The State Medical Board will receive a full report within 72 hours. Security will escort you from the building. Hargrove's expensive watch caught the fluorescent light one last time as he was led toward the elevator, and that small bright flash seemed to be the only thing about him that still gleamed. 3 weeks later, Danielle Ross stood on a stage at Savannah's historic Trustees Theatre with the kind of presence that suggested the building itself had reorganized its architecture to accommodate her. She wore her Navy service dress blues for the first time in 5 years, the uniform hung on her like a second skin she'd never actually removed, just pressed into a closet where her civilian life could pretend to function around its absence. The jacket was midnight blue with gold buttons, the trousers had a perfect crease, and the medals on her chest told stories that official records said never happened. Michael sat in the front row, his teenage frame folded into a chair that seemed too small for his pride, and in his lap he held her old combat boots, the pair she'd been wearing when she'd saved the colonel's life, scuffed and weathered, with laces that had been tied and retied across 3 continents and back again. The Deputy Secretary of the Navy stood at the podium and read from an official citation in a voice that made every word sound like a legal document signed in blood, for exceptional civilian service demonstrating the highest standards of medical expertise and moral courage under circumstances that would test the commitment of career military personnel. Danielle Marie Ross is awarded the National Civilian Service Medal. The audience stood. It was a standing ovation that started in the front row and moved backward like a wave, encompassing hospital staff who had worked beside her without knowing who she actually was, veterans in the audience who recognized something in her bearing that only people who'd been forged in similar fires could identify, Her son's friends who understood on some cellular level that they were in the presence of someone genuinely dangerous in the quiet way that actually mattered. Colonel Reeve stood in his dress uniform, chest out, jaw set. Torres the liaison stood. Commander Price stood. They all stood because standing was the only language adequate for what had just been articulated. Danielle accepted the medal, its ribbon blue and white like water and foam, and she stood at attention as cameras flashed. The audience wouldn't sit until she saluted. So she raised her hand in that precise diagonal movement that started from her shoulder, and the cameras captured her hand against her forehead like someone finally answering a question that had been asked for 5 years. Later, outside the theater where the Georgia rain had stopped and left everything smelling like copper and whetstone, a reporter asked about Dr. Hargrove. Danielle glanced at Torres, who gave a small nod. "He's selling supplemental insurance," she said quietly. From a folding table outside a strip mall on Route 80. "Last I heard." Michael added with the ferocity of a 17-year-old whose mother had been systemically dismantled by a man now hawking insurance policies. He tried to destroy someone who saved lives he couldn't even understand. Danielle rested her hand on her son's shoulder. Her hand didn't tremble. It never had. Commander Price approached with official documents folded precisely in half. Sacred Heart had offered her the position of Director of Emergency Medical Services, reporting directly to the board. The office was already cleared of Hargrove's belongings. She would start Monday. The salary would be $320,000 annually. She held the documents without reading them because she already knew what they said: visibility, recognition, the right to exist without erasure. That evening, she returned to Hillcrest Cemetery in Savannah where the headstones stood like quiet sentinels over names that meant everything to someone and nothing to the rest of the world. She wore her medal. The combat boots she placed at the base of James's stone: James Patterson Ross, Lieutenant, Navy EOD, 1984 to 2013, killed in service in Helmand Province, honored and remembered. She stood at attention. Salutes are performed by living hands for the dead who can no longer salute back, and then she walked toward the parking lot where Michael waited in the car, watching his mother return from a conversation with a ghost who had finally given her permission to be real. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If Danielle's story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, invisible, or forced to hide who you actually are, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your own story in the comments. We amplify the voices that institutions try to silence. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story of invisible strength finally made visible.